My wife and her family forgot to invite me to Christmas, so I bought myself a mountain. When my wife showed up with a locksmith to steal it for her brother, they thought I was alone. They had no idea I had a lawyer, cameras, and a deputy on my side. My name's Grant Lawson, and before this particular Christmas, I genuinely believe there were certain things that just didn't happen in real life, like accidentally supergluing your hand to your face, or forgetting your wallet on a cross-country road trip, or, I don't know, leaving your entire husband behind during the most family-oriented holiday of the year. Turns out I was wrong about that last one, because my wife's family managed to pull off what I can only describe as a spectacular feat of selective memory that would make a goldfish look like it had its life together. It started innocently enough, the way most disasters do. Sabrina had been talking about Christmas plans for weeks, throwing around phrases like family tradition and everyone's going to be there, with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for people who've never actually spent extended time with her family. I should have known something was off when she stopped mentioning specific details and started using a lot of vague hand gestures whenever I asked about logistics. You know, the kind of hand-waving that says, "Don't worry about it," but actually means, "I'm absolutely not going to deal with this right now because I'm pretty sure you're not going to like the answer." The group chat should have been my first real clue. Sabrina's family has this monstrous text thread called Lawson Family Christmas Magic, which is, without exaggeration, the seventh circle of hell in notification form. It's the kind of chat where her mother Carol sends 14 consecutive messages about napkin colors. Her brother Ethan shares motivational quotes at 6 in the morning that nobody asked for, and various cousins post blurry photos of their kids doing absolutely nothing remarkable with captions like "blessed beyond measure." I'd learned to mute it years ago for my own mental health, checking it maybe once a day just to make sure nobody had died or won the lottery. So there I was, December 25th, sitting in my living room that still had last week's mail scattered on the coffee table, eating leftover lasagna straight from the Tupperware container, because honestly, what's the point of dirtying a plate when you're dining solo? The heating vent above my head was making this rattling sound it had been making since October, the kind of mechanical judgment that seemed to say, "Really, dude? This is what your life has come to." The Christmas tree we'd put up together 2 weeks ago stood in the corner, lights twinkling away like they were mocking my situation, all dressed up with nowhere to go and nobody to appreciate them except me and my lukewarm pasta. That's when curiosity got the better of me and I decided to check the family group chat. Big mistake. Huge. The kind of mistake that changes the trajectory of your entire week, possibly your entire marriage, and definitely your relationship with Italian food. The screen lit up with a barrage of messages I'd somehow missed, and right there at the top was a photo that made my stomach drop faster than the temperature outside. It was the whole gang: Sabrina, Carol, Ethan, his wife Marla with her very pregnant belly, Sabrina's dad Richard, and about 7 other relatives I vaguely recognized from Thanksgivings past. All of them dressed in matching cream-colored sweaters that looked like they cost more than my car payment, holding champagne glasses up to the camera with snow-covered mountains visible through the massive windows behind them. The caption read, "The whole family together in Aspen. Merry Christmas from the Lawsons," followed by approximately 47 emojis including several Christmas trees, champagne bottles, and inexplicably, a flamingo. I sat there, fork halfway to my mouth, tomato sauce probably dripping onto my sweatpants that I'd been wearing for 2 days straight, trying to process what I was seeing. The whole family. The whole family. I looked around my empty living room just to make absolutely sure I hadn't somehow teleported to Aspen without realizing it. Nope, still in suburban Connecticut, still very much alone, still very much not in a cream-colored sweater or anywhere near a champagne glass. I scrolled through the subsequent messages, each one a fresh little dagger to my already wounded pride. There was Carol posting about the amazing dinner at this darling little restaurant where we had to wait an hour, but it was so worth it. And Ethan sharing a selfie on the slopes captioned, "Family bonding time hits different." And even Sabrina herself chiming in with "Best Christmas ever with my favorite people," with a heart emoji that felt like a personal attack. My thumb hovered over the keyboard about 17 times as I tried to figure out what to say. Should I be angry? Confused? Should I play it cool? Should I just send a photo of my lasagna with the caption, "Living my best life"? Before I could decide, my phone buzzed with a private text from Carol. Of course it was Carol. Carol, who signs her text messages like they're formal letters. Carol, who once told me at Thanksgiving that my energy was very interesting, which I'm pretty sure was passive-aggressive speak for, "I don't particularly like you, but I'm too polite to say it directly." The message read, "Hi Grant, sweetie. We thought you were busy with work stuff. Hon, you're always so dedicated to your job. Hope you're having a nice quiet day. Zoxo, Mom Carol." I stared at that message for a solid 3 minutes, letting the audacity of it really sink in. They thought I was busy with work stuff. On Christmas Day, they thought that I, a brand consultant whose entire job description involves making other people's chaos look organized and whose office had been closed since December 23rd, would be so swamped with non-existent work that I couldn't possibly make it to a family vacation that nobody had bothered to actually invite me to. The logic was so circular it could have been a carousel. "Yeah, Carol, I wanted to text back. I'm super busy. Busy being married to your daughter. Busy living in the house that has both of our names on the mortgage. Busy wondering how an entire family manages to coordinate matching sweaters, book flights, arrange accommodations, and pack suitcases without once thinking, hey, shouldn't we maybe mention this to Grant?" But I didn't send that. Instead, I set my phone down, looked at my pathetic lasagna, and then looked at the heating vent that was still judging me with its mechanical rattle. That night, after I'd finished the lasagna and moved on to stress-eating Christmas cookies that were meant for some party we were supposed to host, but obviously weren't going to anymore, I made a decision. It was the kind of decision that felt simultaneously completely insane and perfectly rational, the kind of decision that probably required more thought, but was going to happen anyway, because spite is a powerful motivator, and I had apparently been storing up a lot of it without realizing. If I wasn't invited to their Christmas, if my presence was so forgettable that an entire family could pack up and leave town without once considering whether I might want to come along, then fine. I'd throw my own Christmas. Solo. Silent. And preferably somewhere around 3,000 feet above sea level where the air was thin, the views were spectacular, and most importantly, where my wife's family and their matching sweaters and their passive-aggressive text messages couldn't reach me. I opened my laptop, cracked my knuckles, and thought to myself, Grant Lawson, it's time to buy yourself a mountain. Here's the thing about being a brand consultant that most people don't understand. My entire job is essentially professional gaslighting. Companies come to me with their dumpster fires, scandals, PR nightmares, products that nobody wants, services that make people actively angry, and I make it all look intentional, curated, and somehow aspirational. I once rebranded a failing juice company that had been sued 3 times for false advertising by pivoting them to raw authenticity and charging twice as much for the same product. It worked. People lined up around the block. So yeah, I'm professionally trained to take chaos and make it look like somebody's 5-year plan, which means I'm also really good at convincing myself that terrible ideas are actually strokes of genius. That's the headspace I was in at 2 o'clock in the morning on December 26th, sitting at my kitchen table with my 4th cup of coffee going cold next to my laptop, still wearing the same sweatpants from the day before, because honestly, why bother changing when your wife is in Aspen pretending you don't exist? The rational part of my brain, the part that usually reminds me to pay bills on time and not send angry emails after 10 p.m., had clocked out for the evening. The irrational part, the part that runs on spite and caffeine and the kind of reckless energy you only get when you've been publicly humiliated by people who are supposed to love you, had taken over the controls. I opened Zillow, which under normal circumstances is just a way to torture yourself by looking at houses you can't afford in neighborhoods you'll never live in. But tonight it felt like a portal to possibility. I typed in mountain cabin, and then, because I apparently have a flair for the dramatic when I'm sleep-deprived, added isolated and dramatic views. The search results loaded and I started scrolling past the usual suspects. Cute little log cabins that looked like they belonged on a syrup bottle, rustic A-frames that screamed, "We have a family game night every Friday." Charming cottages with wraparound porches where you could imagine drinking lemonade and waving at neighbors. And then I saw it. This thing was different. This wasn't a cabin. This was an architectural statement, the kind of place that didn't invite you in so much as dare you to be worthy of it. A black A-frame perched on a ridge in some town called High Timber that I'd never heard of but immediately wanted to know everything about. The photos showed sharp angles against an even sharper skyline, floor-to-ceiling windows that probably cost more than my car, and a deck that jutted out over what looked like approximately nothing but air and pine trees for miles. It looked like Batman's vacation home. If Batman decided he needed a break from Gotham and wanted somewhere to brood in style with better Wi-Fi and less crime. The listing described it as a modern minimalist retreat for the discerning buyer seeking privacy and elevation, which in real estate speak means nobody else wants to drive up here, but if you do, you'll feel incredibly superior about it. It had been on the market for 6 months, which should have been a red flag, but instead felt like fate. It was waiting for me. It was waiting for someone who needed to make a point, someone who had just been forgotten on Christmas and was ready to make some questionable financial decisions in response. I clicked on the contact information for the listing agent, and my phone was in my hand before I could talk myself out of it. The number rang twice before a woman's voice answered, crisp and alert in a way that suggested she either never slept or was naturally caffeinated. Maya Linwood, High Timber Realty. How can I help you? She sounded way too awake for midnight, the kind of person who probably goes for runs at 5 a.m. and describes them as energizing, without a trace of irony. Yeah, hi, I said, suddenly aware that I hadn't actually planned what to say. I'm looking at your listing for the black A-frame on Ridgepoint Drive. Can I see it? There was a pause on the other end, the kind of pause that suggested she was trying to figure out if I was serious or if this was some kind of prank call. I could practically hear her brain working through the logistics of someone calling about a property viewing at an hour when normal people are either asleep or watching infomercials about kitchen gadgets they don't need. You mean, now? She finally asked, and there was a laugh in her voice, not mean but definitely surprised. It's midnight, on the day after Christmas. Are you okay? It was a fair question, honestly. I was not okay. I was the opposite of okay. I was a man whose wife had accidentally on purpose forgotten him during the holidays, and who was now sitting in his kitchen in dirty sweatpants, seriously contemplating buying a mountain house out of spite. Yeah, now, I confirmed, doubling down on the insanity because at this point, what did I have to lose besides sleep and possibly my dignity, both of which were already pretty compromised? I'm emotionally unstable, and I have Wi-Fi. Let's do this. I could hear Maya trying not to laugh on the other end of the line, that specific sound of someone who's dealt with enough weird clients that nothing really surprises them anymore, but this is definitely making it into her top 10 stories. All right, she said, and I could hear rustling in the background, probably her grabbing keys and a jacket and maybe questioning her career choices. I'll meet you there in 45 minutes. Fair warning though, the road up is a little rough this time of year, and your phone's going to lose service about halfway up. You sure about this? Was I sure? Absolutely not. Was I going anyway? Absolutely yes. I gave her my information, got the address, and hung up feeling like I'd just set something in motion that I couldn't take back, which was exactly the energy I was going for. The drive up to High Timber took just over an hour because apparently the GPS wanted me to take scenic routes, which at 2 in the morning just meant roads where you can't see anything, and there are probably bears. The town itself was one of those blink-and-you-miss-it mountain communities that exists primarily for people who think suburbs are too crowded and enjoy the sound of silence punctuated occasionally by wildlife. Maya was already there when I pulled up, standing next to a sensible SUV and holding a thermos that I desperately hoped contained coffee. She looked exactly like someone named Maya Linwood should look. Practical hiking boots, a fleece jacket that had definitely seen some actual hiking, and the kind of competent energy that suggested she could probably build a cabin with her bare hands if necessary. Grant Lawson? She asked, extending a hand. The man crazy enough to house hunt at 2 a.m.? I shook her hand and followed her up the path to the house, my phone flashlight barely cutting through the darkness. And then she unlocked the door and flipped on the lights, and I saw the interior for the first time. It was perfect. Not perfect like, oh, this is nice. Perfect like, this is exactly what I didn't know I needed until this exact moment. The main room was all exposed beams and that massive window wall looking out at nothing but darkness right now, but I knew from the photos would be spectacular come sunrise. There was a loft area that looked down on the living space, a kitchen that was small but efficient in that way that said someone had actually thought about how a kitchen should work, and a fireplace that took up half a wall and looked like it could heat the entire place or possibly summon demons, depending on how you used it. So, Maya said, watching me take it all in. What do you think? I turned to her and said, "I'll take it. How fast can we close?" She blinked at me, clearly trying to figure out if I was serious. You don't want to see it in daylight? Maybe bring your wife up? Have an inspection? Wife. Right. The wife who was currently in Aspen having the best Christmas ever with her favorite people, a category that apparently didn't include me. No wife involved in this decision, I said firmly. And I want to close under an LLC. Iron Pine. I pulled the name out of nowhere, but it sounded right. Solid. Permanent. The kind of name that meant business. Maya raised an eyebrow but nodded slowly, already pulling out her phone to take notes. "You're serious," she said, and it wasn't really a question. "Dead serious," I confirmed. "I make bad decisions look intentional for a living. This is just another Tuesday for me. Except it's Wednesday, and I'm buying a mountain. By sunrise, I'd signed more papers than I knew existed, wired more money than I probably should have without sleeping on it, and officially become the owner of a black A-frame in High Timber, Colorado, under Iron Pine LLC. Maya handed me the keys as the sun started painting the mountains pink and orange, and said, "Welcome to High Timber. Try not to freeze to death." It was the beginning of either the best decision I'd ever made or the most expensive mistake of my life, and honestly, I was good with either option at this point. Moving into the A-frame was less like a traditional home relocation and more like voluntarily signing up for the world's most expensive camping trip, except instead of Esmores and acoustic guitars, I had power tools and a growing collection of hardware store receipts that would probably make my accountant weep. I didn't have furniture because furniture requires planning, and planning requires admitting to yourself that you're actually doing this insane thing, which I wasn't quite ready to do yet. What I did have was a sleeping bag rated for temperatures I hoped I'd never actually experience, a thermos that had become my emotional support object, and enough coffee grounds to fuel a small army or one very determined man going through what was either a midlife crisis or a late-onset rebellious phase. The first night in the house, I slept on the floor in the main room because the idea of climbing up to the loft felt like too much commitment. The sleeping bag was spread out in front of the fireplace that I hadn't figured out how to use yet, and I lay there staring up at the exposed beams thinking about how this was either the most empowering thing I'd ever done or the most elaborate way to avoid couples therapy ever invented. Probably both. The wind outside made this howling sound that was either atmospheric and cool or genuinely terrifying, depending on my anxiety levels at any given moment, and I could hear small animals, or what I desperately hoped were small animals, skittering around on the roof like they were holding some kind of woodland creature convention up there. But here's the thing about spite. It's an incredibly powerful motivator. More powerful than inspiration, more reliable than motivation, definitely more effective than those self-help books that tell you to visualize your success while doing morning affirmations in the mirror. Every morning I woke up on that increasingly uncomfortable floor, I thought about Sabrina and her family in their matching sweaters and their coordinated vacation, and then I got up and fixed something. It became my routine, my therapy, my middle finger to the universe in the form of home improvement. The fireplace was my first conquest, and let me tell you, figuring out how to properly operate a wood-burning fireplace when you've spent your entire adult life with central heating is humbling in ways I wasn't prepared for. I watched approximately 14 YouTube videos, read the manual that the previous owners had left in a drawer like it was some kind of ancient text, and then spent an entire afternoon gathering wood from the covered pile out back that Maya had mentioned during the walkthrough. The first 3 attempts produced nothing but smoke and disappointment. The 4th attempt produced actual flames and a sense of accomplishment so profound I literally stood there watching it burn for 20 minutes like I'd just discovered fire for the first time in human history. When those flames finally caught and held, dancing up the chimney exactly like they were supposed to, I felt like an absolute god. Not a minor god, either. We're talking full Zeus-level deity status. I texted a photo to myself with the caption, "I am Prometheus," and then immediately deleted it because even in my isolated mountain madness, I knew that was too much. But I felt it. Every crackle of that fire was validation. Every burst of warmth was proof that I could do this, that I didn't need Sabrina's family or their passive-aggressive text messages or their ability to coordinate group vacations without me. From there, it became an obsession. Every screw I drilled into the wall to hang up the basic shelving I'd bought from the hardware store in town. a place run by a guy named Dutch who looked at my designer boots and immediately knew I was from out of town, but was too polite to say anything. Felt like I was building something real. Every light fixture I replaced, swapping out the builder-grade garbage for something that actually looked intentional, was another piece of evidence that I could create something better than what I'd left behind. Every smart lock I installed, upgrading the security system to something that would make Fort Knox jealous, was a declaration that this space was mine and mine alone. The hardware store became my second home, and Dutch became something like a friend, though we mostly communicated through nods and his helpful ability to point me toward whatever section I was clearly struggling to find. He never asked why a guy who obviously worked in an office was buying enough tools to stock a small construction company, and I appreciated that about him. The town of High Timber operated on a strict mind-your-own-business policy that I found deeply refreshing after years of living in a suburb where your neighbors knew your business before you did and felt entitled to comment on everything from your lawn care to your marriage. By the end of week 2, I had Wi-Fi installed by a technician named Carlos who made the trek up the mountain and said "nice place" in a tone that suggested he'd seen weirder, new cabinets that I'd assembled myself with only moderate cursing and 2 trips back to return the wrong hinges, and what I'd started calling my emotional support sledgehammer. The sledgehammer had originally been purchased for a completely legitimate home improvement purpose that I've honestly forgotten, but it had evolved into something more symbolic. Sometimes I'd just hold it while standing on the deck, looking out at the view, feeling its weight in my hands, and thinking about how satisfying it would be to demolish something if I ever needed to. The deck had become my favorite spot, especially at sunrise when the light hit the mountains in a way that made them look like they were on fire in the best possible sense. I'd stand out there with my coffee, watching the world wake up in complete silence except for the occasional bird that apparently hadn't gotten the memo about winter migration, and feel something that took me a while to identify because I'd been so busy being angry and petty that I'd forgotten what it felt like. Peace. Actual, genuine peace. The kind that doesn't come from meditation apps or wellness retreats or family therapy sessions, but from standing on a deck you bought with your own money, looking at a view that nobody else is entitled to, drinking coffee that you made in a kitchen that's entirely yours. One morning, feeling particularly proud of myself for having survived 2 full weeks of solo mountain living without dying of exposure or being eaten by whatever was having meetings on my roof at night, I took a photo of that sunrise view. The light was hitting everything just right, making the whole scene look like something from a travel magazine, and the deck railing I'd reinforced myself was perfectly framing the mountains in the background. I posted it to my Instagram, which I rarely used except for the occasional work thing, with the caption, "Bought myself some peace and decent Wi-Fi." It felt good, simple, honest, a quiet little victory that didn't need explanation or justification, just a statement of fact. I had removed myself from a situation that wasn't working, and I'd found something better. I hit post, set my phone down on the deck railing, and went back to enjoying my coffee and the view and the profound satisfaction of knowing I'd accomplished something real. For about 11 minutes, it was perfect. The sun continued rising, the coffee stayed hot, and I stood there feeling like maybe, just maybe, I'd figured something out about life and happiness and the importance of having your own space. And then my phone started buzzing. Not just once or twice like a normal notification, but continuously, like it was having some kind of electronic seizure. I picked it up and watched in real time as my screen filled with notifications, comments, tags, messages, all of them coming in so fast the phone couldn't keep up. My post had been screenshot. Of course it had been screenshot. And that screenshot had been sent to the family group chat. The same family group chat that had documented their Aspen adventure without me. Carol had found it, and Carol had opinions, and Carol was about to make my quiet mountain victory into a family crisis. I watched the messages pile up in the group chat, each one worse than the last, and realized that my peaceful morning was officially over. The phone kept buzzing in my hand like an angry hornet, and I thought about my emotional support sledgehammer sitting just inside the door. Maybe, just maybe, I was going to need it sooner than I thought. The thing about family group chats is that they're essentially digital hostage situations where you can't leave without causing an international incident, and every notification carries the potential to ruin your entire day. I'd learned this years ago when I first got added to Lawson Family Christmas Magic, and made the rookie mistake of trying to contribute actual opinions. Now I just muted it and checked in periodically like someone monitoring a natural disaster from a safe distance, occasionally throwing in a thumbs up emoji to prove I was technically still alive and participating in family life. But standing on my deck that morning, watching my phone have what could only be described as a full-blown panic attack, I knew something had shifted from the usual background noise of Carol posting recipes nobody asked for to something far more sinister. I opened the family chat with the kind of dread usually reserved for opening medical bills or clicking on emails from your boss sent at 11 p.m. on a Sunday, and sure enough, there it was, my Instagram post, screenshot and dissected and repurposed in ways I hadn't thought possible. Carol had posted it with a caption that made my blood pressure spike so fast I probably should have sat down. Look everyone, Grant bought a perfect mountain getaway. Just in time. Ethan and Marla need somewhere to stay while their condo's being renovated. God works in mysterious ways. This is such a blessing. She'd added approximately 40 emojis including praying hands, houses, babies, and for some inexplicable reason, a taco. The taco felt like an insult, though I couldn't articulate exactly why. I blinked at the phone, then at my coffee, which suddenly seemed wildly insufficient for whatever this day was about to become. Then back at the phone, hoping maybe I'd misread it, that my caffeine-deprived brain had somehow scrambled the words into something that made more sense. But no, it was still there, getting worse with every passing second as family members started chiming in with their enthusiastic support for this plan that I had absolutely zero involvement in creating. Aunt Patricia, how generous of you, Grant. Family takes care of family. Uncle Rob, that's the spirit. Nothing like family helping family through tough times. Cousin Jessica, wow Grant, we always knew you had a big heart. Was I hallucinating? Had I accidentally ingested some kind of psychedelic mushroom with my breakfast? Was this actually happening? Or was I having a very specific stress dream brought on by too much isolation and not enough human contact? I refreshed the chat just to make sure this wasn't some kind of glitch in the matrix. But it was real and getting more real by the second as more family members piled on with their congratulations for my apparent generosity in offering up a house that nobody had asked me about. Then Ethan himself jumped into the chat, and that's when things went from bad to, I need a lawyer and possibly a restraining order. He sent a photo, an actual photograph, of moving boxes stacked in what I assumed was his current living room, and several of them were labeled in thick black marker. Nursery, baby clothes, Marla's maternity stuff. The image was slightly blurry like he'd taken it in a hurry, probably too excited about his free housing to bother with basic photography skills, and he'd captioned it with, already packing. So grateful for family. When can we get the keys? When can we get the keys? When can we get the keys? Like this was already decided, already arranged, already a done deal that just needed the minor formality of me handing over access to property that I'd purchased with my own money during what was clearly a spite-fueled breakdown, but was still legally and entirely mine. Because nothing says Merry Christmas like a hostile baby invasion orchestrated by your mother-in-law who apparently missed her calling as a military strategist or maybe a cult leader. My thumbs hovered over the keyboard as I tried to figure out how to respond to this absolute insanity. Part of me wanted to write a lengthy explanation about property rights and boundaries and the basic concept of asking before assuming, complete with footnotes and possibly a PowerPoint presentation. Another part of me wanted to just send a string of question marks until my phone ran out of character space. But the part of me that had survived 2 weeks alone on a mountain, that had figured out how to light a fire and install smart locks and assemble cabinets with only moderate crying, knew exactly what needed to be said. I typed 3 words, no, I've made other plans. It was possibly the most satisfying text message I'd ever composed in my entire life. Not sorry, but no. Not let me think about it. Not can we discuss this? Just a flat, unambiguous rejection that left zero room for negotiation or misinterpretation. 3 words and a lifetime of therapy packed into one message. The digital equivalent of closing a door in someone's face and locking it behind you. I hit send and watched the message appear in the chat. A single line of text in a sea of exclamation points and baby emojis and assumed generosity. For exactly 12 seconds, there was silence. I could almost hear the collective gasp through the phone. could practically feel the shock waves radiating out from wherever various family members were reading this unprecedented act of defiance. Carol was probably clutching her pearls. She definitely seemed like the type of woman who owned actual pearls for clutching purposes. Ethan was probably staring at his phone in confusion because in his world, family simply didn't say no to family, especially when family needed something. Then the floodgates opened and my phone became a weapon of mass guilt tripping. Carol was the first to respond, naturally, because Carol had apparently been training her entire life for this exact moment of emotional manipulation. Grant, honey, I think there's been a misunderstanding. We're not asking you to do anything. We're just so excited that you're in a position to help family when they need it most. Ethan and Marla are in a really tough spot with the renovation and the baby coming, and you have all that space just sitting there empty. All that space just sitting there empty. Like my house was some kind of public resource that I was selfishly hoarding instead of, I don't know, my personal property that I'd bought specifically to get away from these people. Ethan chimed in next, his message dripping with the kind of passive-aggressive disappointment that probably worked great on his employees, but just made me want to dig in harder. Uncle Grant, I thought family meant something to you. We're not asking for a handout, just some temporary help during a difficult time. Marla's really stressed about the baby, and this would give us so much peace of mind. Uncle Grant. He'd call me Uncle Grant like that somehow made this whole thing more wholesome. Like invoking my future relationship with his unborn child would somehow guilt me into handing over my keys. The man was bold, I'd give him that. Completely delusional and operating under some wild assumptions about how property ownership worked, but bold nonetheless. Aunt Patricia decided to pile on with her own special brand of concerned trolling. Grant, sweetie, are you feeling okay? This doesn't sound like you. Maybe you should take some time to think about this. Family is forever. The implication being, of course, that I was having some kind of mental health crisis that was preventing me from seeing the obvious rightness of letting my brother-in-law and his pregnant wife move into my house without my permission or even a basic conversation about it first. I watched the messages multiply, each one a fresh variation on the theme of, how dare you not immediately comply with our demands, and felt something settle in my chest that was equal parts rage and clarity. These people, my wife included, because Sabrina still hadn't said a single word in the chat, which was somehow worse than if she'd actively participated, genuinely believed they were entitled to my space, my privacy, my carefully constructed escape from exactly this kind of family drama. My phone buzzed with a direct message from Sabrina, finally, and I opened it with the kind of resignation you feel when you know the news is bad, but you have to look anyway. Grant, can you please just talk to them? They're really stressed, and you're making this so much harder than it needs to be. It's just for a few months while the condo gets fixed. Why are you being so difficult? Why was I being so difficult? Why was I being so difficult? I stared at that message for a long moment, standing on my deck overlooking mountains that belonged to me, in a house that I'd bought and furnished and fixed up with my own two hands, and I realized something fundamental. I wasn't being difficult. I was being clear. There's a difference, and it was about time my wife and her family learned what it looked like. I didn't respond to Sabrina. Instead, I went back into the main chat, took a screenshot of Carol's original message, and started a new text to Maya Linwood, my realtor who'd sold me this place and had given me her number for emergencies or weird questions about mountain living. This definitely qualified as weird, and possibly an emergency, depending on how aggressive my in-laws decided to get about their imaginary claim to my property. Maya, I typed, I need a good lawyer. Preferably one who specializes in property law and has experience dealing with entitled family members. Know anyone? Her response came back in under 2 minutes. Oh boy. Yeah, I know someone. Her name's Sable Winters, and she doesn't mess around. Want me to send you her info? Sable Winters. Even the name sounded like someone who could end this nonsense with a single raised eyebrow and a strongly worded letter. Yes, please. I texted back, and then I went inside to make more coffee because I had a feeling this was just the beginning of a very long battle, and I was going to need all the caffeine I could get. The phone call from Carol came at 7:30 in the morning, which was either calculated to catch me off guard or timed for maximum dramatic impact, possibly both. I was in the middle of my third cup of coffee, standing on the deck watching a family of deer do absolutely nothing interesting in the clearing below, when my phone started vibrating with her contact photo. A picture from some family barbecue where she's wearing a sun hat the size of a small vehicle and holding a glass of white wine like it's a religious artifact. I considered not answering, letting it go to voicemail where I could deal with it later or possibly never. But curiosity got the better of me because I genuinely wanted to know how she was going to spin this latest development. Grant, she said the moment I picked up, and her voice had that specific wobble that meant she was either genuinely crying or doing an excellent impression of someone who was genuinely crying. Grant, how could you? You're breaking this family apart. Ethan and Marla are devastated. Devastated. Do you know what stress does to a pregnant woman? Do you even care? The guilt trip was coming in strong right out of the gate. No warm-up, no pleasantries, just straight to the emotional manipulation that she'd probably been rehearsing since my no in the group chat yesterday. Here's what I wanted to say. Carol, your son is a 34-year-old man with a job and a condo that's allegedly being renovated. And if he can't figure out temporary housing without commandeering his uncle's property, that's a planning problem, not a family emergency. What I actually said was nothing, because I'd learned years ago that engaging with Carol when she was in full victim mode was like trying to reason with a hurricane. Pointless, exhausting, and you'd just end up wet and miserable. Are you even listening to me? She continued, her voice climbing an octave. This is what family does, Grant. Family helps family. Family doesn't just abandon people when they need help the most. I thought we raised Sabrina to marry someone with values, but clearly, she kept going, building up a full head of steam about values and family and disappointment and how this was going to affect the baby's emotional development somehow. But I'd stopped listening somewhere around the third mention of family because I'd made a decision. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I didn't try to explain my position for the 100th time or defend my choices or justify my boundaries. Instead, I said very calmly, Carol, I need to go. I have an appointment. And then I hung up while she was mid-sentence about the importance of putting family first. It felt incredible, like cutting a rope that had been slowly strangling me for years. My hands were shaking slightly from the adrenaline, but it was the good kind of shaking, the kind that comes from finally standing up for yourself after spending way too long being accommodating. I immediately pulled up Maya's text with Sable Winter's contact information and dialed before I could second-guess myself. The phone rang exactly twice before a voice answered that could only be described as professionally intimidating. Sable Winters. Not, hello, not Winters Law Office. Just her name delivered like a statement of fact that you'd better take seriously. Her voice had this quality that made you instantly believe she'd never lost an argument in her entire life and wasn't about to start now. Ms. Winters, my name is Grant Lawson. Maya Linwood gave me your number. I have a situation that's rapidly escalating from annoying to potentially illegal, and I need someone who can make it stop. I gave her the quick version, the forgotten Christmas, the Spite House purchase, the family group chat ambush, the assumption that my property was somehow communal family resources, and Carol's crying phone call that had just ended approximately 3 minutes ago. There was a pause on the other end, and I could hear the clicking of a keyboard like she was already taking notes or possibly pulling up property records to verify I wasn't completely insane. Let me make sure I understand this correctly, Sable said, her tone shifting into what I recognized as lawyer mode, precise and analytical. Your in-laws are attempting to move into your property without your consent, without a lease agreement, and without any legal claim to the residence. Is that accurate? That's putting it mildly, but yes, that's the situation in a nutshell. A very dysfunctional, boundary-challenged nutshell. I could hear her making an amused sound that might have been a laugh if lawyers were allowed to express that kind of emotion during business calls. Mr. Lawson, this isn't family drama. This is attempted property trespass with a side of harassment. The fact that they're related to you doesn't give them any special rights to your real estate. I'm going to send you some documents that we'll need filled out, and then I'm going to draft a cease and desist letter that will make it very clear that your property is not available for occupation, temporary or otherwise. The way she said it, so matter-of-fact and unbothered, made me want to hire her for every aspect of my life. Grocery store out of my favorite coffee? Call Sable. Internet provider trying to raise rates? Call Sable. Existential dread about my marriage? Probably call Sable. We talked for another 20 minutes, going through details about the property, the LLC I'd set up, my relationship to the various family members involved, and the specific threats or pressure I'd received. Sable asked questions like she was building a case for trial, even though we both knew this would probably never see the inside of a courtroom. It was all about having everything documented, everything official, everything legally airtight, so there was no room for misinterpretation or creative boundary pushing. One more thing, she added before we hung up. I'm going to recommend you upgrade your home security immediately. Install cameras, smart locks, the works. People who feel entitled to your property have a tendency to escalate, especially when you introduce legal consequences. I want everything documented from here on out. It was slightly terrifying advice, the kind that made me realize this situation might get worse before it got better, but also strangely validating because it meant I wasn't overreacting, that my concerns were legitimate enough that a professional was telling me to prepare for potential home invasion by my own relatives. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, I had an email from Sable Winters with a document attached titled No Trespass Notice. Loss in residence. That was 6 pages of the most beautiful legal language I'd ever read. It was polite but absolutely devastating, the written equivalent of a steel door slamming shut and locking from the inside. It outlined in excruciating detail that the property located at Ridgepoint Drive was privately owned, that no invitation for occupation had been extended, that any attempt to enter or occupy the premises without explicit written permission would constitute criminal trespass, and that legal action would be pursued to the fullest extent of the law. She'd CC'd it to me with a note. This should handle it. If it doesn't, call me immediately. I printed 3 copies. One for my files, one to mail to Ethan and Marla's address that I pulled from an old Christmas card, and one to mail to Carol and Richard, because why leave anyone out of the fun? Putting those envelopes in the mailbox at the end of my driveway felt like mailing tiny bombs of legal reality, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't enjoy it immensely. But Sable's advice about security kept echoing in my head, so I made a trip down the mountain to the only electronics store within 50 miles, a place called Peak Tech that was run by a guy in his 20s named Jordan who got way too excited when I explained I wanted to turn my house into something resembling a secure government facility. Oh man, yeah, I can totally set you up. How paranoid are we talking? Like normal paranoid, or are we going full doomsday prepper? Somewhere between I want to know if a squirrel farts on my porch and my in-laws are trying to stage a housing coup, I told him, and to his credit, he didn't even blink. By the time we were done, I had a shopping cart full of smart locks, security cameras with night vision, motion sensors, and a doorbell camera that could probably identify someone's dental records from 50 feet away. Installation took the rest of the afternoon and most of the evening, and I won't lie, there was a learning curve involving multiple YouTube tutorials, one minor electrical shock that I'm pretty sure took a year off my life, and a creative amount of swearing that probably scared the local wildlife. But by 10 p.m., I was sitting at my kitchen table watching 4 different camera feeds on my laptop, each one showing a different angle of my property in crisp high-definition glory. I created a folder on my desktop and labeled it Mountain Defense Strategy version 1.0 because if I was going to do this, I might as well commit to the bit. My house had officially become Fort Knox with Wi-Fi, and I'd never felt safer or more petty in my entire life. Bring it on, Carol. My wife and her family had actually hired a professional locksmith to break into my house, and they'd done it with the kind of casual confidence that suggested they genuinely believed this was a reasonable course of action. I stood there in my kitchen, wooden spoon still in my hand, watching this unfold on my laptop screen like it was some kind of reality show pilot called Extreme Entitlement, Family Edition, and I was the unwilling star. They piled out of their vehicles, Sabrina first, looking uncomfortable in that specific way that meant she knew this was wrong, but was going along with it anyway, followed by Carol, who was carrying what appeared to be a casserole dish, because apparently home invasion goes better with side dishes. Then Richard, looking stern and patriarchal like he was about to deliver a lecture about responsibility. Ethan trying to help his very pregnant wife Marla out of the back seat. And finally the locksmith, a middle-aged guy in coveralls who was pulling out a drill that looked capable of opening a bank vault. The doorbell camera captured everything in perfect high-definition detail as Carol pressed the button and smiled directly into the lens like she was posing for a Christmas card. I tapped the speaker function on my phone, and her voice came through crystal clear. "Grant, honey, we're here. We brought ham." She held up the casserole dish like it was a peace offering, like carbohydrates and processed meat were somehow going to make up for the fact that she'd just shown up with a tactical team to forcibly enter my property. I took a deep breath, set down my wooden spoon, and pressed the talk button on my doorbell app. "Carol, I can see you. I can see all of you. And I can see the locksmith you brought to break into my house. Congratulations on the ham. Now leave." My voice came out calmer than I felt, which I considered a personal victory given that my blood pressure was probably high enough to require medical intervention. There was a moment of confusion on their faces, that split second where they realized I was watching them in real time and their element of surprise had been completely neutralized by technology and spite. Carol recovered first because Carol always recovers first, her face shifting from friendly surprise to wounded innocence faster than should be humanly possible. "Grant, don't be ridiculous. We're not breaking in, we're family. The locksmith is just here to help us get in since you won't answer the door like a reasonable person." The locksmith himself looked increasingly uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot like he was reconsidering his life choices and possibly his career path. Ethan stepped forward, putting on his best reasonable adult voice. "Grant, come on, man. We drove all the way up here. Marla's exhausted. Can we at least talk about this face to face?" The implication being that if we talked face to face, somehow I'd be convinced to just hand over my keys and let them set up their nursery in my living room. "No," I said through the speaker, watching them all react to the single syllable like I'd just announced I was joining a cult. "You received a legal notice. You were told in writing that you don't have permission to be here. You're currently trespassing, and if that locksmith touches my door, I'm calling the police." I was bluffing slightly because I wasn't 100% sure what the police response time was this far up the mountain, but my threats sounded confident enough that the locksmith took an actual step backward. Richard decided this was his moment to take control, moving to the front of the group with the kind of authoritative energy that probably worked great in boardrooms, but was significantly less effective when you were literally trying to break into someone's house. "Grant, this is getting out of hand. We're coming in to discuss this like adults whether you like it or not. We have a right to talk to you." He gestured to the locksmith, who honestly looked like he wanted to be literally anywhere else, possibly on a different mountain or in a different profession entirely. That's when the locksmith actually knelt down in front of my brand new smart lock, the one I'd spent 45 minutes installing and another 20 minutes programming, and pulled out his drill. He was actually going to do it. They were actually going to drill through my lock, on camera, with me watching and telling them not to, because they genuinely believed their family status gave them some kind of legal immunity or divine right to my property. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking with a combination of anger and disbelief that this was actually happening. The dispatcher answered with a calm professionalism that I desperately needed in that moment. 911, what's your emergency?" "Yeah, hi. I'm at 42 Ridgepoint Drive in High Timber, and there are people on my property trying to break in with a locksmith. I've told them to leave multiple times. I have video evidence, and they're currently attempting to drill through my front door lock." Saying it out loud made it sound even more insane than it felt, which was really saying something. The dispatcher asked a few more questions. Were they armed? Did I feel in immediate danger? Was I safe inside? And then told me a deputy was already on his way and should be there within 10 minutes. 10 minutes felt like an eternity, but I watched the camera feed as the locksmith's drill touched my lock, and I realized I had audio recording too. "Stop," I said through the speaker, my voice harder now. "I've called the sheriff. You have about 9 minutes to get off my property before this becomes a criminal matter instead of just a family embarrassment." That got their attention. Carol's face went pale. Sabrina grabbed her mother's arm like she was trying to physically hold her back from saying something stupid, and the locksmith stood up so fast he nearly dropped his drill. But it was already too late because coming up the driveway, lights flashing red and blue against the darkening sky, was a sheriff's SUV that looked like divine intervention in vehicle form. Deputy Reed Miller emerged from his cruiser with the kind of deliberate slowness that suggested he'd dealt with domestic disputes before and wasn't particularly impressed by this one. He was probably in his 50s, built like someone who'd done actual physical labor before becoming law enforcement, and his face had that expression of professional disappointment that immediately made everyone on my porch look like guilty teenagers caught sneaking out past curfew. "Evening, folks," he said, his voice carrying that specific authority that comes from years of dealing with people at their worst. "Someone want to tell me what's going on here?" He looked at the locksmith first, then at the drill, then at my front door with its very obvious brand new lock, and I could see him putting the pieces together in real time. I pressed the speaker button again. "Deputy Miller, I'm Grant Lawson, the property owner. I'm inside. These people are my wife's family, and they're attempting to force entry into my home despite receiving written legal notice that they don't have permission to be here." Carol opened her mouth to protest, but Deputy Miller held up one hand in a gesture that immediately shut her down. "Ma'am, is this your property?" he asked Carol directly. She stammered something about family and misunderstandings and how they just wanted to talk. "That's not what I asked. Do you own this property or have written permission to be here?" The answer was obviously no, and even Carol couldn't spin that into something positive. Deputy Miller proceeded to inform them, in language so clear a child could understand it, that they were trespassing on private property, that attempting to hire a locksmith to gain unauthorized entry constituted attempted breaking and entering, and that they needed to leave immediately or face arrest. The locksmith was already packing up his tools before Miller finished the sentence, probably running through every decision that had led him to this moment and resolving to screen his clients better in the future. "But officer," Ethan started, and Miller cut him off with a look that could have stopped traffic. "Sir, I'm going to suggest very strongly that you and your family take your ham and go home. Mr. Lawson has made his position clear. You've been legally notified, and continuing this behavior is only going to result in criminal charges. Is that really what you want?" They left, slowly, reluctantly, with Carol trying to make eye contact with my cameras like she could guilt-trip me through surveillance footage. But they left. The locksmith's van was first down the driveway, probably breaking several speed limits in his hurry to escape, followed by the family vehicles in a defeated little parade. Deputy Miller stayed behind for a few minutes, taking my statement through the doorbell camera and assuring me that if they came back, I should call immediately. When his taillights finally disappeared down the mountain, I stood there in my kitchen, chilly, forgotten, and probably burned by now, and realized I was grinning. It was possibly the best Christmas gift I'd never asked for. Watching my boundary-challenged in-laws get served with reality by law enforcement while standing on my porch holding ham they'd never get to eat in my house. I genuinely thought it was over. Not over in the everyone's going to suddenly become reasonable and respect boundaries way, because I'm not delusional, but over in that they got embarrassed by law enforcement and will at least take a few weeks to regroup before trying something new way. I figured I'd bought myself some time, some peace, maybe even a quiet stretch where I could just exist on my mountain without my phone buzzing with fresh family drama every 6 hours. I should have known better. I really, truly should have known better, because underestimating Carol's determination was like underestimating a hurricane's commitment to ruining beach vacations. Foolish and ultimately expensive. Christmas morning arrived cold and bright. The kind of picture-perfect winter day that makes you want to believe in greeting cards and goodwill toward men and all that hopeful garbage. I was sitting by my fireplace with my coffee, actually feeling something adjacent to contentment, scrolling through my phone with the lazy energy of someone who has nowhere to be and nobody to answer to. That's when I saw it. A Facebook notification that Carol had tagged me in a post. Carol barely used Facebook except to share minion memes and recipes for casseroles that nobody in their right mind would actually make. So being tagged by her was unusual enough that I clicked on it immediately, which was my second mistake of the day after checking my phone at all. The post was a masterpiece of manipulation disguised as gratitude, the kind of thing that should probably be studied in psychology classes as an example of how to weaponize social media. So blessed. It began, because of course it did, because every manipulative Facebook post starts with someone declaring how blessed they are about something that's actually terrible. Ethan and Marla found a safe new home to start their family. Thank you to everyone who helped make it possible. She'd attached a photo, my photo, the one I'd posted of my deck at sunrise, and added about 60 emojis including babies, houses, hearts, and praying hands. The comments were already rolling in from people who had no idea what was actually happening, friends of Carol's from her book club or church or wherever she collected her army of enablers. How wonderful, and family is everything. And congratulations, Ethan and Marla. Nobody was asking the relevant questions like, whose house is that? Or did the owner actually agree to this? Or is this potentially illegal? Because Carol had framed it in a way that made it sound like some kind of community miracle instead of what it actually was, a bizarre attempt to manifest squatters' rights through social media manifestation. I sat there staring at my phone, watching my blood pressure climb with each new comment, each new congratulations, each new person buying into Carol's alternate reality where I'd somehow agreed to house her son and pregnant daughter-in-law despite multiple legal documents saying the exact opposite. My first instinct was to comment directly on the post with something like, "Interesting interpretation of events. Carol, considering I had the sheriff remove you from my property 3 days ago for attempted breaking and entering." But I'd learned enough about public family drama to know that would just make me look like the villain. She'd positioned it so that any denial from me would make me seem cruel, petty, or, her favorite accusation, not a team player when it came to family. I screenshot the post instead, adding it to my growing folder of evidence that my in-laws had collectively lost their minds, and I was about to set my phone down and try to salvage what was left of my peaceful Christmas morning when a Facebook message popped up from someone I hadn't talked to in probably 5 years. Derek Chun, a guy I'd gone to college with who I mostly remembered for his ability to quote entire Monty Python movies from memory and his extremely questionable taste in fraternity party themes. We'd been decent friends back in the day, but had drifted apart in that natural way people do after graduation when you realize you had nothing in common except proximity and cheap beer. "Hey man," his message read, and I could already tell from those 2 words that whatever came next was going to make my day worse. Random question, but is your father-in-law Richard Lawson? Tall guy, kind of intense, drives a huge truck? I confirmed that yes, that was indeed my father-in-law, while simultaneously wondering where this was going and whether I needed to pour something stronger than coffee. "Dude, he's at my dad's country club right now literally bragging about managing your property. Something about tenants and rental income? Thought you should know because it sounded weird. Managing my property. Managing my property." Richard was out there telling people at a country club where these things get around and turn into gossip and potentially screw with my professional reputation, that he was somehow involved in managing my house. The audacity was actually impressive in a horrifying way, like watching someone juggle chainsaws while riding a unicycle. You have to respect the commitment even as you're terrified of the inevitable disaster. I thanked Derek for the heads up, my hands already moving to open my laptop, because if Richard was out there claiming property management rights, I needed to know what else they'd been doing behind the scenes. The county website for property records was one of those government sites that looks like it was designed in 1997 and never updated, all broken links and weirdly formatted text. But I navigated to the property lookup section and typed in my address with the kind of dread usually reserved for checking your bank account after a night of drunk online shopping. There it was, buried in the recent activity section, a mail forwarding request. Someone, and I had exactly one guess who, had filed paperwork with the post office to forward mail addressed to Ethan and Marla Lawson to my address. My address. The one they didn't live at. The one they'd never lived at. The one they'd been physically and legally barred from entering. They were trying to establish residency digitally, creating a paper trail that suggested they had legitimate ties to my property, even though the only thing they had legitimate ties to was an impressive collection of boundary violations and a restraining order that was looking more necessary by the minute. I clicked through more records, my coffee getting cold next to me as I fell down a rabbit hole of bureaucratic manipulation. There was a change of address form. There was a utility inquiry. Someone had called the electric company asking about the account at my address, probably trying to figure out if they could somehow get their names added. There was even a notation about a delivery attempt for furniture that I definitely hadn't ordered, with Ethan's name on the recipient line and my address as the destination. They were building a case for residency without ever setting foot in the house, creating a digital footprint that suggested they lived there, that they had permission to be there, that this was their home, and I was just being difficult about letting them access it. It was fraud, not family drama, not a misunderstanding, not a difference of opinion about boundaries. Actual, prosecutable, document and send it to the authorities fraud, but executed with the kind of confidence that only comes from genuinely believing you're in the right, even when you're absolutely, catastrophically wrong. I took screenshots of everything, my folder labeled Idiots with Wi-Fi. Exhibit A growing by the minute. Each new piece of evidence was another nail in the coffin of any sympathy I might have had left for their situation. If Ethan and Marla needed housing, that was unfortunate, but not my problem. If Carol wanted to help them, she had a perfectly good house with guest rooms. If Richard wanted to manage property, he could start with his own. But this systematic attempt to fraudulently establish residency through mail forwarding and utility inquiries and furniture deliveries. This was so far beyond acceptable family behavior that it had lapped back around to being almost admirable in its sheer audacity. I called Sable Winters, who answered on the second ring despite it being Christmas morning, which either meant she had no life or took her job very seriously, possibly both. "Mr. Lawson," she said, and I could hear something that might have been amusement in her voice. "I had a feeling I'd hear from you today. What happened?" I filled her in on the Facebook post, the country club bragging, the mail forwarding, the whole digital invasion strategy that my in-laws had apparently workshopped over ham and denial. "Perfect," she said, which was not the response I was expecting, but was definitely the response I needed. "They've gone from stupid to criminal. Mail fraud is federal. The utility stuff is fraud. The furniture delivery is attempted delivery fraud. Your father-in-law's claims about property management could be construed as identity theft or fraud, depending on how he's positioning it. This is actually great news. Only a lawyer could describe my family's escalating criminal behavior as great news, but I understood what she meant. They'd crossed a line from annoying to prosecutable, from family drama to actual legal liability. I'm going to file an emergency motion," Sable continued, and I could hear typing in the background. "We're going to freeze all of this. The mail forwarding, any utility attempts, any deliveries. I'm also going to recommend we get a formal restraining order instead of just the cease and desist. And Mr. Lawson, keep documenting everything. Every post, every message, every attempt at contact. When this goes in front of a judge, I want a paper trail so comprehensive it could be published as a book." I hung up feeling something between vindicated and exhausted. Like I'd won a battle, but the war was clearly going to drag on longer than I'd hoped. My phone buzzed with a text from Sabrina, her first direct communication with me since the locksmith incident. "We tried the nice way. You left us no choice." I stared at that message, trying to parse the logic that led from "we tried to break into your house with a locksmith" to "we had no choice but to commit mail fraud," and came up empty. I didn't reply. I just screenshot it and added it to the folder, watching the file size grow like a tumor made of bad decisions and family dysfunction. Outside my window, snow was starting to fall, peaceful and quiet and completely at odds with the chaos unfolding in my phone. "Yeah," I thought, "Merry Christmas to me." Sable Winters operated with the kind of efficiency that made me wonder if she was actually human or some kind of extremely effective legal robot programmed to destroy people's bad life choices. Within 24 hours of our Christmas morning phone call, she'd filed motions that read like poetry if poetry could make grown adults cry and reconsider their entire approach to family conflict. The cease and desist she sent out this time wasn't the polite warning shot from before. This was a legal document, so sharp it could probably cut glass if you printed it on the right paper, the kind of thing that makes you grateful you're not on the receiving end and slightly concerned about what happens to people who ignore it. She froze everything. The mail forwarding got canceled faster than a celebrity tweet that didn't age well, with a formal complaint filed to the postal inspector because apparently messing with someone's mail is the kind of federal offense that gets taken seriously even when your excuse is, "But we're family." The utility companies got letters explaining that any attempts to add names to the account or transfer services without the property owner's written consent would be considered fraud and prosecuted accordingly. Even the furniture delivery got intercepted. Sable somehow tracked down the company, explained the situation in whatever terrifying lawyer language she used, and got them to return the items to the sender with a note that future delivery attempts to that address for anyone other than Grant Lawson would be refused. Watching her work was like watching a master chess player dismantle an opponent who didn't realize they were playing chess and thought this was just a friendly game of checkers. Every move was calculated, every document filed with precision, every loophole closed before my in-laws even knew the loophole existed. She sent me updates throughout the day with subject lines like "motion filed re," "mail fraud," and "utility freeze confirmed," and my personal favorite, Your father-in-law's country club friend received a friendly clarification letter, which I assume meant someone at Derek's dad's club got a legal document explaining that Richard's claims about property management were, to use the technical term, complete bullshit. I was starting to think maybe, finally, this was the end of it. Maybe the combination of legal threats, frozen utilities, canceled mail forwarding, and the general embarrassment of having a lawyer send cease and desist letters to everyone in their orbit would be enough to make them back down and find literally any other solution to their housing situation. Maybe Richard would realize that bragging about managing property he had no legal connection to was a bad look. Maybe Sabrina would finally grow a spine and tell her family to knock it off. Maybe I'd win the lottery and grow wings and learn to speak fluent Mandarin while I was at it, because apparently I was in a fantasy thinking kind of mood. At 2:13 in the morning, approximately 6 days after Christmas and 3 days after Sable's legal blitzkrieg, my phone lit up with a security alert that jolted me out of the kind of deep sleep you only get when you've been stress-eating chili and watching true crime documentaries until midnight. Motion detected. Mailbox. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, nearly knocking over the glass of water I'd left there, and pulled up the camera feed with one eye still closed because my brain hadn't fully committed to being awake yet. The night vision cameras turned everything into that eerie green-gray color that makes everything look like a low-budget horror movie, but there was no mistaking the figure hunched over my mailbox at the end of the driveway. Richard, my father-in-law, Richard Lawson, who allegedly had better things to do at 2 in the morning than commit what I was pretty sure was another federal crime, was shoving something into my mailbox with the furtive energy of someone who knew they were doing something wrong, but had convinced themselves it was justified. I watched him fumble with papers, glancing around like he thought someone might be watching. Which, buddy, someone definitely was watching, and that someone had a camera system that could probably identify your dental work from this distance. He stuffed whatever documents he'd brought into the mailbox, closed it carefully like that somehow made this less criminal, and then hustled back to his truck that he'd parked about 50 yards down the road, presumably because he thought parking directly in front of my house would be too obvious. The man had watched too many heist movies and learned all the wrong lessons. The truck's taillights disappeared down the mountain road, and I sat there in my bed, fully awake now and trying to decide if I was more angry or impressed by the sheer commitment to this insane plan. I threw on jeans and a jacket over my pajama shirt because there was no way I was going back to sleep without knowing what Richard had just hand-delivered to my mailbox in the middle of the night like some kind of deranged Santa Claus bringing presents nobody asked for. The walk down my driveway in the freezing cold at 2:30 in the morning, armed with a flashlight and a growing sense of disbelief at my life choices, gave me plenty of time to contemplate how I'd gotten here. A year ago, I was a reasonably successful brand consultant with a wife and a normal suburban life, and the biggest drama in my world was whether clients would approve my logo designs. Now I was retrieving mystery documents from my mailbox at an hour when the only other living creatures awake were probably coyotes and insomniacs, all because I'd married into a family that viewed boundaries as suggestions and property law as more of a guideline than a rule. I opened the mailbox and pulled out a stack of papers that had been folded and shoved in haphazardly, the kind of sloppy work that suggested Richard had been in a hurry or possibly having second thoughts halfway through. I unfolded them right there under my flashlight, the beam shaking slightly from a combination of cold and adrenaline, and started reading what can only be described as the most amateur attempt at legal forgery I'd ever seen. There were forms, official-looking forms that had probably been downloaded from some sketchy website, claiming Richard Lawson as the authorized property manager for the residents at my address. There were rental agreements with Ethan and Marla's names on them, complete with forged signatures that didn't even remotely match mine, and a monthly rent amount that was insultingly low. There was even a notarized document, except the notary information was clearly fake, using a stamp that looked like it had been made with a potato and some ink. It was the kind of thing that would have been funny if it wasn't also deeply concerning that a grown man with a functioning career thought this would somehow hold up under any kind of scrutiny. Did he think I wouldn't notice? Did he think the legal system operated on a first-come, first-served basis, where whoever filed the most paperwork won regardless of whether that paperwork was legitimate? Was this genuinely his plan, or was this a desperate Hail Mary from someone who'd backed himself into a corner and couldn't figure out how to get out? I took the papers, walked back up to my house with my breath fogging in the cold air, and the first thing I did was scan every single page. Then I pulled up the camera footage, clipped the relevant section showing Richard's 2 a.m. mailbox crime spree, and sent everything to Sable with an email subject line that read, "Adding to the evidence pile. Mail fraud with a side of forgery." It was 3 in the morning by the time I hit send, but I knew Sable would see it first thing, and I wanted her to have time to work her legal magic before Richard woke up and realized he'd just handed me enough evidence to bury him. Her response came through at 8:47 a.m., which meant she'd been up for hours and had probably already filed 6 motions before most people had their first coffee. Got it. Emergency protection motion being filed within the hour. This is textbook harassment, fraud, and forgery. Judge Carter owes me a favor. We should have a hearing by end of week. Keep your doors locked and cameras running. The casual mention that she had judges owing her favors was both reassuring and slightly terrifying, like finding out your accountant is also friends with the IRS commissioner. By noon, true to her word, Sable had filed an emergency motion for a restraining order that included the camera footage, the forged documents, the mail forwarding attempts, Carol's Facebook post, Richard's country club claims, and probably a few other things I'd forgotten about in the chaos. The motion was a work of art, laying out a pattern of behavior that escalated from annoying to illegal with a timeline so detailed it could have been a true crime podcast episode. She'd included everything, creating a narrative that even someone with zero legal knowledge could follow. This family had systematically attempted to occupy property they didn't own through increasingly criminal means, and they needed to be legally stopped before someone got hurt or something got damaged. At 12:05 p.m., my phone buzzed with a text from Sabrina. Not a call, not a voicemail, just a text that appeared on my screen like a tiny bomb of passive aggression. "We tried the nice way. You left us no choice." I read it 3 times, trying to understand the logic that connected nice way to hired a locksmith to break into your house, or committed mail fraud, or forged property management documents at 2 in the morning. The mental gymnastics required to frame any of their behavior as nice deserved some kind of Olympic medal for creative delusion. I didn't reply. I didn't call. I didn't engage at all because engaging meant playing their game, and I was done playing games. Instead, I screenshot the message, saved it with a timestamp, and added it to my folder titled Idiots with Wi-Fi. Exhibit A, which had grown from a few megabytes to what could probably be published as a comprehensive guide to what not to do when your family member buys a house you want. The folder was practically an archive at this point, a digital museum of boundary violations and criminal behavior, all neatly organized and ready for whatever judge would eventually have to look at this mess and decide who was actually crazy here. Outside my window, the mountains sat peaceful and unconcerned with human drama, the way mountains do. Inside my house, I made another pot of coffee and settled in to wait for whatever came next. Because if there was one thing I'd learned from this entire experience, it was that with this family, there was always something next. New Year's Eve arrived with the kind of crisp, clear weather that makes you believe in fresh starts and new beginnings, and all that optimistic garbage people tell themselves when one arbitrary calendar date rolls over into another. I woke up that morning with a plan, and for once it wasn't a plan born out of spite or panic or 3 a.m. caffeine-fueled decision-making. This was strategic. This was calculated. This was me finally learning from weeks of reactive chaos and deciding to get ahead of whatever nonsense my in-laws were. Inevitably planning, because if there's one thing I'd learned about Carol and her crew, it's that they viewed court orders the way most people view terms and conditions agreements, as suggestions that definitely don't apply to them personally. Sable had given me a heads up 2 days earlier that the restraining order had been filed and approved by Judge Carter with what she described as enthusiastic support, which apparently in legal terms meant the judge had taken one look at my evidence folder and said something along the lines of, "Are these people serious?" The order was crystal clear. No contact, no property visits, no communication except through legal representation. Violation would result in immediate arrest and contempt charges. It was beautiful, comprehensive, and worth every penny I was paying Sable, which at this point was probably enough to buy a small car, but felt like a bargain given the peace of mind. But here's the thing about people who've spent their entire lives getting their way through persistence and emotional manipulation. They don't give up just because a judge tells them to. They regroup, They strategize, they find loopholes or create new approaches, and they absolutely do not respect boundaries just because those boundaries now have legal enforcement behind them. So I figured if they were going to show up, and my gut said they were definitely going to show up, I wanted witnesses. Not just any witnesses, but the kind of people who could testify in court if needed, and who would also make it socially awkward for my in-laws to pull their usual routine. That's how I ended up throwing a New Year's Eve party in a house I'd owned for less than a month, inviting people I'd known for varying lengths of time, but all of whom had one thing in common. They thought this whole situation was absolutely insane and were morbidly curious to see how it played out. My coworker Priya showed up first, carrying a bottle of wine that probably cost more than my monthly utilities and wearing a sweater that said, "New Year, New Boundaries," which she'd apparently gotten custom-made just for this occasion. She worked in our creative department and had the kind of dark sense of humor that made her excellent at branding campaigns and even better at calling out dysfunctional family dynamics. Gabe arrived next with his boyfriend Marcus, both of them bringing enough fancy cheese to feed a small army and the kind of supportive energy that made me remember why I'd stayed at my company for 7 years despite the occasionally soul-crushing nature of making chaos look intentional for corporations. Gabe had been my work friend who'd evolved into an actual friend somewhere around year 3, the kind of person who'd helped me move apartments and never once asked invasive questions about my marriage until I brought it up myself. Luce, whose real name was Lucas, but everyone called him Luce because of an incident involving cargo pants and an unfortunate wardrobe malfunction during a client presentation that nobody would let him forget, showed up with craft beer and a Bluetooth speaker already playing a playlist he'd titled Spite House Warming. My mountain neighbors Sarah and Tom were the last to arrive, and I'd only met them twice before when they'd stopped by to introduce themselves and warn me about the bears that occasionally wandered through during warmer months. They were in their 60s, had lived in high timber for 30 years, and had the kind of no-nonsense attitude that came from dealing with actual wilderness instead of suburban drama. Sarah brought homemade cookies that were somehow both festive and threatening, and Tom brought a story about the last person who tried to squat in a vacation home up here and how that had ended with the sheriff's department and a very cold night spent in a cell. We set up in the main living area with the fire going, hot cocoa on the stove because I decided alcohol would make me either too relaxed or too aggressive and I needed to stay somewhere in the middle, and chili simmering in a slow cooker that Priya had insisted I buy because apparently I couldn't live on canned soup forever. The conversation flowed easily, the kind of laughter that echoes off exposed beams and makes a house feel like an actual home instead of just a strategic purchase made during an emotional crisis. For a few hours, I almost forgot why I'd invited them, almost relaxed into the idea that this was just a normal New Year's Eve party with friends instead of a carefully orchestrated witness protection program. Then headlights cut through the darkness outside, 2 sets of them coming up the driveway in a formation that suggested coordination and planning. Everyone in the room felt the shift, conversations trailing off as we all turned toward the windows like we were watching the opening scene of a horror movie where the monsters arrive right on schedule. I walked to the window and saw 2 SUVs parking in front of my house with the confidence of people who believe they had every right to be there, and I muttered, "Well, look who RSVP'd late to the party." Priya appeared next to me with her wine glass, peering out into the darkness. "Is that them? Please tell me that's them because this is better than any Netflix show I've watched this year." I confirmed it was indeed them, and she actually grinned like Christmas had come a week late, pulling out her phone to start recording because she was nothing if not prepared for drama. They emerged from the vehicles like a badly coordinated tactical team. Carol and Richard from the first SUV, Sabrina driving the second with Ethan, and a very pregnant Marla in the back, and trailing behind them all was a guy in a cheap suit carrying a briefcase who I'd never seen before, but who radiated the energy of someone who'd made very poor career choices. The doorbell rang, and I let it ring 3 more times before I opened the door, making them wait just long enough to be uncomfortable but not long enough to seem petty, which was a delicate balance I'd been practicing. "Grant," Carol started, but I held up one hand, and she actually stopped talking, which might have been a first in recorded history. "Before you start, I want to introduce you to my friends. This is Priya, Gabe, Marcus, Luce, Sarah, and Tom. They're all here celebrating New Year's Eve with me in my house, which I own, on my property, which I also own. Everyone, This is my wife's family, who you've heard so much about." The man in the cheap suit stepped forward, extending a hand that I deliberately didn't shake. "Mr. Lawson, I'm Theodore Harrison, a licensed mediator. Your family has retained my services to help facilitate a reasonable discussion about the property situation. I understand there's been some confusion about the arrangement." I cut him off with a laugh that was probably harsher than it needed to be, but felt absolutely justified. Confusion? Is that what we're calling attempted breaking and entering now? Mail fraud? Document forgery? That's some creative rebranding, Mr. Harrison, and I say that as someone who does rebranding professionally. He blinked at me, clearly not prepared for someone who wouldn't immediately defer to his mediator authority, and fumbled with his briefcase to pull out papers that looked official but probably weren't. "According to our understanding of the situation, you consented by silence to your family's use of the property. The lack of explicit denial constitutes implicit agreement in cases of familial property sharing." It was such obvious bullshit that I couldn't help but grin, the kind of grin that probably made me look slightly unhinged, but I was way past caring about appearances. "Then by that logic, Mr. Harrison, my silence right now means get off my porch. My continued silence will mean you're all trespassing. And if you stick around long enough, my silence might evolve into, I'm calling the police again. How's that for implicit communication?" Behind me, I heard Luce actually snort into his beer, and Priya was definitely still recording all of this for what would probably become legendary group chat content later. That's when Deputy Reed Miller stepped out from behind the door where he'd been waiting. Because yes, I'd given him a heads up that this might happen, and he'd agreed to swing by as a routine welfare check that happened to coincide with my party. And the look on Carol's face was worth every moment of stress from the past month. Reed looked at the assembled family with the kind of professional disappointment that suggested he'd rather be literally anywhere else, but was committed to doing his job anyway. "Evening, folks," he said, his tone carrying about as much warmth as the freezing air outside. "I have here a court order, restraining order filed and approved by Judge Carter 3 days ago, that explicitly prohibits any of you from being on this property or making contact with Mr. Lawson. You're all currently in violation of said court order. Congratulations, you're served." He handed papers to Richard, Carol, Ethan, and even Sabrina, each one of them taking their copy like it was a bomb that might explode if they held it wrong. Marla burst into tears, her voice climbing into that register that only pregnant women and professional singers can hit. "I'm not raising my baby in a stolen house. This is insane. We just need help, and you're all treating us like criminals." The irony of calling my house stolen while actively trying to steal it apparently escaped her completely, and honestly, the tears might have worked on me a month ago, but now they just felt like another manipulation tactic in a very long line of manipulation tactics. "Ma'am," Deputy Reed said, his tone gentler but still firm, "nobody's asking you to raise your baby in this house. Mr. Lawson has made it clear you don't have permission to be here. That's not theft, that's property ownership. I'm going to suggest very strongly that you all leave now before this escalates to arrests." Marla was the first to crack, turning and waddling back to the SUV with Ethan trailing behind her, looking like he'd just realized that maybe, possibly, his family had been wrong about all of this. Carol tried one more time, her voice taking on that pleading quality that had probably worked on me dozens of times over the years, but I just shook my head and closed the door, watching through the window as they slowly, reluctantly piled back into their vehicles and disappeared down the mountain road. Mr. Harrison, the mediator, stood on my porch for a few extra seconds, looking at his briefcase full of useless papers, and I almost felt bad for him. Almost. Then I remembered he'd tried to argue that silence equals consent, and my sympathy evaporated. He left last, walking to his car like a man seriously reconsidering his career path and maybe his entire approach to conflict resolution. When the taillights finally disappeared, I turned back to my friends who were all staring at me with expressions ranging from shocked to delighted. Priya raised her wine glass. "That was the best thing I've seen all year, and I'm including the year that's about to end and the one we're about to start." We went back to our party, the chili, the cocoa, the countdown to midnight that felt more significant than usual because it really did feel like an ending and a beginning. When the fireworks started going off down in the valley, visible through my massive windows, I stood there surrounded by people who'd shown up when I needed them and thought maybe, finally, this nightmare was actually over. The SUVs disappeared down the snowy road, tail lights fading like bad memories finally getting the hint. I closed the door, turned the deadbolt that had survived a locksmith invasion and came out stronger, and looked at my friends who were all grinning like they'd just witnessed the season finale of their favorite show. "Anyone want more cocoa?" I asked, heading toward the kitchen. The marshmallows are undefeated tonight. The room erupted in laughter, the good kind that fills a space and makes it feel alive. Outside, fireworks cracked over the valley in bursts of gold and silver, somebody down in high timber celebrating the new year with enthusiasm and probably some questionable fire safety decisions. Inside, I felt something better than revenge, something more lasting than satisfaction. I felt peace. Peace with Wi-Fi, peace with boundaries, peace with the radical concept that sometimes the best thing you can do for yourself is lock a door and mean it. When you're married into chaos long enough, silence feels revolutionary. So yeah, my wife forgot to invite me to Christmas. That's fine. I bought myself a mountain. And unlike her, I know how to lock a door.